Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, all right. You're coming in crystal clear. How you doing?
Okay, very good. I guess I need to turn on my camera, which I haven't done. There we go.
Never hurts. If you end up
Okay.
having bandwidth issues because you're transmitting video as well, then we can just cut the video feed. Because you said that you're on a hotspot right now?
Yeah, I'm on a hotspot right now because apparently the power is still spotty in my area, but I don't know if it looks okay through the hotspot. Then if you could just go with that.
Yeah, you look and sound good. I'm just getting it set up on my end now. Why is the internet down? Did the BLM riots tear through one of the local power boxes?
As far as I know, unless the BLM riots unleashed a tropical storm, then we can just attribute it to natural factors.
Well, we don't know, do we?
Well, I mean, we don't. It hasn't been confirmed one way or another, so I guess it's an open question.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But I just got back here on Saturday, and my internet's been down since I arrived. So,
Gotcha. Well, I am
just
sorry.
shows you how wonderful the infrastructure is in these parts.
Yeah, you're in Jersey City, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. I haven't had the pleasure of visiting. All right. First of all, do you, because we got some folks watching, do you want to introduce yourself before we get into it?
Sure. My name is Michael Tracey. I do journalistic stuff. I'm a journalist. But people have varying definitions of what journalism constitutes nowadays. So I don't really self-identify with that term all that much, although, it does roughly apply, I would say. And I write for a variety of different publications, and I do some YouTube, podcasts, different types of media. And that's my very roundabout description of myself.
Nice. I'm pretty much hardlining into the YouTube game, so that's where I've put all my eggs.
Okay.
I forget the exact context.
Yeah, YouTube is kind of it was never my primary. It was never what I perceived as my primary mode of output online. I just kind of fell into it through the Young Turks, mostly, and ever since it's just one of sort of many modes of output.
It's the future of the journalism game. Frankly, we've got so many hot, new commodities running up, like Tim Pool, who are really speaking truth to power. I forget the exact context by which we came into contact. I know you tweeted or you said you'd be willing to talk to me, which I appreciate. Many people often aren't. I noticed that a lot of the people who responded to that were dissuading you from speaking to me, which was a little disheartening, I'll admit. I do like being liked, as I think many people do. But I've actually been familiarizing myself with your content over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, I'd heard of you years prior, but getting more into it. And I had a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Just on the point of context, just to establish it, not that anyone particularly cares, but I mean, if you're interested in knowing, I got some messages saying that you had mentioned perhaps wanting to talk to me, or you invited me on a stream. I don't know if that was true or not. Maybe it was a concerted troll campaign that was successful. But either way, I was more than willing to talk to you or pretty much anybody within reason, and if there's a reasonable baseline of kind of good faith exchange.
I may or may not have said that.
That was the context.
At some point, I say a lot of things, but I'm happy to be speaking to you. So what do you consider yourself politically? Like, if I had to ask you, like, what how would you self-describe politically?
I did an AMA on the subreddit Stupid Poll a few days ago, and I got a variation of this question because, and by the way, in terms of the responses that I got to people saying, "Oh, don't talk to Vosh," I would get that for almost anybody across the political spectrum. So that's not going to dissuade me from having a conversation, as long as, again, there's a reasonable kind of foundation of good faith upon which the conversation can be built. But in terms of how I identify myself, over time I've been less and less interested in devising for myself a firm ideological category, and that's not because I have some aversion to people who are immersed in quote unquote ideology and make that a central component of their view of the world. But I guess because my base instinct tends to be a little more journalistic in nature, I'm less inclined to proffer a comprehensive view of the world that could be distilled into a particular label than I am putting forth a critique that can be bolstered with reportage and obviously analysis. But that all said, I've been a registered Democrat my entire life. I'm still a registered Democrat. Not that party affiliation in the United States is that meaningful, but it definitely was a major part of my self-conception, definitely in my early years. And if you're in many states that still have closed primaries, you need to be registered with a particular party in order to vote in primaries. So I've always voted. If I've ever voted, it's always been for a Democrat. And I would say that, there's some intrinsic tendency within me that does make me more naturally affiliate with the left and the right. That being said, I've often found it very fruitful to engage constructively with the right and write for their publications, appear on their media networks and such. So I don't constrain myself by a particular label, and not through some false notion of centrism and both sides are equally bad and that kind of thing, but just because it's not, I find, what my animating drive is in engaging on a political level.
All right, that's fair enough. I think that actually ties pretty well into what I wanted to talk about, because I've seen a lot of takes from you online. I think I disagree with about 90% of them. But sometimes when I see people who agree with you, they'll tend to place you on the left. And I've noticed that there's this new breed of, I don't know if I would call them left-leaning person, but perhaps former Democrat. And for some reason, all these people are associated with Tulsi Gabbard, and I'm going to get to that. But they're people who sort of ostensibly adopt the presumed civility of somebody who believes fundamentally in human rights equality, but then do nothing but criticize the left or Democrats, or in your case, pretty pointedly, BLM. And what it seems to work towards is sort of a broader body of literature, which is dedicated almost exclusively to bolstering conservative talking points. I've seen you say quite a few things about BLM. Most of them seem to be, at least from my perspective, pretty concerned, trolly efforts of delegitimizing the protests. I saw your happy birthday, by the way, belatedly. I saw your birthday tweet the other day. You identify as it not being your birthday, the epic helicopter joke, which Tulsi Gabbard responded to. So I guess that sort of fits in parallel there.
I don't actually know what people were informing me about the epic helicopter joke. I frankly was not.
It's pretty
aware
epic.
Of that joke.
The helicopter.
I'm sure it's astoundingly epic, but that was not what guided my impulse to make a very offhand joke that I was a little bit struck that people reacted so.
No, it's great. Well, my issue is when a lot of people criticize you, I don't even see, because I saw that stupid poll AMA, by the way. When one person asked you what your political identification was, your answer was crypto fascist. I'm not so mired in the left, so it's not to recognize a joke. Of course,
that was a joke. Yeah.
No, I know, because crypto fascists probably wouldn't say that. But I did think it was funny. I did laugh when I read that.
Good. Then it accomplished its goal.
Oh, certainly, yeah. But unfortunately, it also accomplished another goal, which is making me wonder if there's a political motivation behind you not really assigning a political label to yourself. Which brings me to, what do you actually think of the BLM?
I'm not. Hold on. I'm not. I don't purport that I'm totally free of political motivations. So if somebody can divine some trend in my commentary or reporting or what have you that is indicative of a political motivation, I'm not going to object to that on the grounds of I claim that I'm in some kind of vacuum and therefore political forces cannot possibly be evident within me. I mean, that's not what I'm saying in terms of my base instinct, and so yeah, that's why I'm open. I'm open to reasonable critique if you or anybody else has one. So I'll let you just.
Oh yeah, no,
continue
wonderful.
On to your
That's
question.
My favorite thing. What do you think about the BLM riots generally? Because I've seen two takes from you. One of which actually got you to speak with Tucker Carlson, which was, I mean, he's one of the biggest media figures right now in the country, so that's astonishing. Essentially, well,
I mean, just so you know, I've been appearing on Tucker Carlson's show intermittently since 2016. So it's not like I do, hatched some kind of plot where I said, "Oh my God, if I do this, maybe I'll get invited onto Tucker Carlson."
No. I'm not accusing you of
what I occasionally do now for 4 years. Yeah,
in that respect. No. I'm just curious. So how do you feel about the BLM protests? Because all I see from you on these protests is criticism. With regards to the first, it was the social distancing thing, and to my knowledge, the medical experts have come out and they've said, well, for the most part, these protests aren't really contributing to the spread of COVID-19 because it's outdoors.
I don't think that's been established at all, in any way that's satisfactory. But that's sort of a side issue, I guess.
By what criteria would you determine what a satisfactory determination for that is, above the medical experts?
Well, I mean, do you have a particular expert opinion that you're citing? Because there was one draft paper that went around that hadn't been peer reviewed, which was then uncritically reported on by a lot of media personalities and journalists who have a political or personal investment in the movement, and are therefore interested in preserving the unimpeachability of its public image.
Don't you think that's a little bit conspiratorial of you to suggest that these journalists had a bias in misreporting medical information to promote a political agenda?
You think it's conspiratorial to say many journalists and activists have a deep political and personal investment in the sanctity of the Black Lives Matter /protest movement? That's been erupting for the past 2 months?
If you believe they're deliberately reporting on insubstantial medical information, then yeah, I would say that's fairly conspiratorial. From what I can see, yeah,
I'm not positing a conspiracy. I'm not positing a conspiracy. I'm simply saying that if you grant that a particular journalist is very much invested in a movement such that he or she wants to safeguard the image of that movement in terms of how it's perceived in the public, then it's nothing at all conspiratorial to suggest that might lead to coverage decisions which leave blind spots or don't capture the full scope of the story.
Well, I would say
for example, I mean, you're telling me that in Houston, where you had an outbreak of the virus that perfectly correlates with when you'd expect to see an outbreak in the aftermath of historically large mass gatherings. You're telling me that the protests, you can go look at the photos of it in Houston and also in Austin, some other parts of Texas, had zero to do with the outbreak. I simply do not believe that, because we have firsthand
but you've jumped points here. Just really quickly, the initial point that you made was about the purported agenda of the journalists reporting on the medical information presented. Now you've jumped to saying that the medical information is incorrect. So right now, the medical consensus, and you can look this up right now, is that no, the protests really don't seem to be meaningfully contributing to the spread of COVID-19 because they're taking place outdoors. They tend to follow social distancing guidelines. They wear masks, and the heat also.
They don't tend to follow social distancing guidelines, but that's
to a greater extent than other comparable protests, yeah, such as the anti-mask protests the conservatives have been running for a while now. The issue is,
I wasn't in favor of the anti-mask protests. I was scornful of those for the same reasons, although these have been taking place on a far grander scale. And according to the New York Times, this is the largest protest movement in U.S. history. So that's a little bit different in terms of the order of it.
New York has had massive BLM protests, and they have tapered down on the virus thanks to incredibly good handling on the part of their state. And the Houston and the Texas ramp up in cases after the protests also perfectly corresponds to the reopening of businesses that took place in that state. Right now, I mean, what you're arguing right now is conspiracy. Like, the medical consensus on this seems to be pretty clear. So for you to continue, you argue there's a bias politically on the part of the journalists. But my argument is there's a political bias on your end, and all the people who claim that with no evidence that the BLM protests would and are massively contributing to the spread of COVID-19, because there wasn't any evidence to support that.
Okay, can I respond?
Yeah, just wanted to lay out that point.
Well, I mean, you mentioned New York City. I would note that in mid-July, the New York City Health Department did say that there had been spikes in infections in New York City amongst age groups between in the 20 to 29 and 30 to 39 range. So, and those are the tends to be the demographics that take part in protests. But I'm not, when I point to Houston and Austin,
That's a tenuous link.
Hold on. Well, but it's relevant. If you're going to just dismiss out of hand that the protest could have had any impact whatsoever on the prevalence of
what
virus.
What do we mean by any? Do we mean like one person across the 330 million people who live in this country? I mean, I can acknowledge that. But what people like you were saying was that that social distancing was going to be ruined by these protests, that all the work we'd done shutting down the country was going to be undone by allowing these people to protest. And the data on this just has not borne out that outcome.
I mean, because the United States data collection capacities in relation to COVID are very substandard in the first place. So it's not as if we have this perfectly accurate
This is conspiracy
data,
again. No, the medical consensus on this is really clear. Now, no. Now you're like, we don't have...
You keep accusing me of positing a conspiracy, but I haven't. I'm not saying that there's some, like, people in a cigar smoke-filled room.
Wait, don't strawman me. I'm not saying that you're claiming there are people in a smoke-filled room. What you're essentially saying right now is that the medical consensus is incorrect.
And I'm not.
You're saying the medical consensus is incorrect because of some tenuous links you've drawn, or we don't have the capacity to draw this data. But you had no problem reporting on the idea. Wait, please. Do you realize the double standard here?
When you make an accusation against me, you got to let me respond.
But I have to finish the accusation. So the problem is you're being very, very, very credulous here, but you have been incredibly insistent that social distancing would be ruined by these BLM protests with no evidence to back it up. And you continue to be insistent on that point in spite of increasing bodies of evidence countering that argument, so I posit to you, the journalists who reported on the safety of the BLM protests aren't the one with political bias. You are. And you're obsessed with this sort of backhanded criticism of the BLM protests because it's easier than actually criticizing the ideological foundations of the movement.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to engage with the ideological foundations of the movement. But we are in the midst of a historic pandemic still that saw a spike at the exact moment you would expect to see it if the biggest mass protest movement in U.S. history had any degree of impact in terms of the spread of the virus. So, and I think you're also overstating medical consensus because you're almost accusing me of being a conspiracy theorist in that you're pitting me against the so-called medical consensus. But I think you're overstating the certitude of that medical consensus. As far as I know, what you're referring to is one study that wasn't peer-reviewed and that was widely reported on, again, by many journalists who have an active interest in bolstering the moral virtue of the...
What is the paper you're referring to?
In many cases,
you're engaging right now in conspiracy by definition, but what is the paper you're referring to?
How am I engaging in conspiracy by definition?
Because right now there is data on my side and none on your side. You're arguing from conjecture, and then you're arguing the only reason data on my side is being accepted due to political... Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this is done by Dave Friedson. This was here. Link this to you. Is this a paper you're referring to? This study uses newly collected data on protests in 315 of the largest U.S. cities to estimate the impact of mass protests on social distancing. So, 315 cities is a pretty huge sample size. I can find some more if you would like. But you will not be able to find any medical evidence to the contrary for me. I know that you won't be able to.
Hold on, I'm just browsing I'm just reading the abstract here to make sure this is the one that I'm having that I was thinking of. Okay, this says event study analyses provide strong evidence that net stay-at-home behavior increased following protest onset, consistent with the hypothesis that non-protest behavior was substantially affected by urban protests. This effect was not fully explained by the imposition of city curfews. Estimated effects were generally larger for persistent protests and those accompanied by media reports of violence. So this is not positing here that the protests themselves had no effect on the spread of the virus. They're analyzing the net effect of protest activity, including on non-protesting populations, which could have, in some instances, decreased the spread of the virus. So if you have, theoretically, protest activity increasing virus spread by 2%, but a decrease in normal non-protester activity diminishing virus spread by 2%, then that's an offset. That doesn't mean that protests have no effect whatsoever on virus spread.
That would be an effect of the protest.
Use common...
Wait, that would be an effect of the protest.
In disincentivizing people from carrying out normal day-to-day activity.
Yes, that would be an effect of the protest.
But you said that it's been concluded that the protests themselves had no or negligible effect on the spread.
That is an effect, yeah. The effect that it
virus.
has on the general population, disincentivizing them from going outside and continuing normal day activity, that is an effect of the protests.
But that's different from saying the protests themselves don't spread the virus. The protests themselves may spread the virus, but the effect of that spread could be offset by the diminishment
anything may spread the virus. The effects of the protests on the virus have been negligible. That's what the data comes to the conclusion of. Through overwhelming evidence, 315 cities, over an extensive period of time.
But that's not... But hold on a second. But that's not what this paper says.
Yeah, it's
the
saying
last
that
line in the abstract is, we conclude that predictions of population level spikes in COVID cases from Black Lives Matter protests were too narrowly conceived because of failure to account for non-participants' behavioral responses to large gatherings.
Yeah, that's an effect of the protest.
But that's not an effect of the protest in the sense of the specific effect that protests had in terms of virus spread.
I mean, would that decrease in people going out and doing normal day-to-day activity be there were it not for the protests? No. So it's an effect of the protest. It works. We get a historic civil rights movement, and we don't get a statistically significant increase in COVID-19. I think that's a win for all. I mean, you do support BLM conceptually, right?
But we had a huge increase.
No. Again, I want you to provide data
after the protests, and when you would expect exactly.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, my dude.
Okay, well, I mean, you could say correlation doesn't equal causation in relation to the reopenings as well. I mean, but I'm not saying that correlation means causation. But you can identify a correlation and then analyze further whether there could be causal.
And the analysis has shown there isn't. Yes. You see a correlation and then you analyze it, and the causation doesn't exist. Why are you so insistent to die on this hill? Wait. If this is an uncomfortable point for you, do you want to move to the actual ideological
causation between, for example, Republican governors reopening their states arguably prematurely, which then you could argue correlated to an increase in the virus? Are you asserting a causation?
I don't have to demonstrate any of this. You're pivoting right now. You're in shambles. You have no data on this. The data supports my point. I don't know why you're so insistent on dying on this hill. This is a tiny hill.
I'm not dying on a hill. I mean, that's a ridiculous sort of cliche. I'm not dying on a hill.
You are. Wait, no, this is a dead point.
For example, why are you dying on the hill of saying that social distancing was honored at these protests? I went to dozens of these protests.
Wait. I'm not dying.
Social distancing on the hill. Is impossible.
I'm not.
So, for example, why on June 1st, 2020,
Michael, why are you pivoting? Michael, I don't need to prove that every BLM protest followed social distancing protocols. What I'm saying is the evidence supports the idea that the BLM protests are not contributing to a statistically significant increase in the spread of COVID-19, a point that the data overwhelmingly supports, that you seem incredibly insistent on attacking for reasons that just escape me.
I think you presupposing that the data, so to say, is totally on your side is
do you have data on your side? Because I just provided a pretty big study.
I have
anecdotal
observational data as a result of 2 months of going around observing.
Right, you have anecdotes.
Protest activity.
You have anecdotes. You're a journalist, dude. Wait, you're a journalist. Do you need me to explain to you how a study is a better way of determining the outcomes of a pandemic response than your anecdotal experiences?
No, I'm saying that you need a wide body of different types of data to understand phenomena in the world. That's not
So you don't need
controversial.
any data to back up your point,
can I-
but I need 2 big studies. 3?
No, I mean, no, I'm not saying that you need big studies. I'm saying that, first of all, this study that you said that you cited didn't even conclude what you said it concluded.
It concluded that the effects of the BLM protests were not contributing.
Study.
The effects of the BLM protests are not contributing statistically significantly to the spread of COVID-19.
That's incorrect. That's not what the study you just cited said.
That is what the people staying at home is an effect.
It said that the predictions of the effect of the protests were too narrowly conceived because it didn't account for the other kinds of behavioral effects that would result as a product of mass gatherings.
And the accounting of those other behavioral effects makes it so that there's no statistically significant effect.
Okay, so for example, when you have municipal officials in Southern California who are Democrats,
this is a pivot,
and who are in favor. It's not a pivot. I'm making a point that is related to the overarching point that you're trying to hammer here. So I'm not pivoting by providing arguments.
I mean, if it's an argument for a different point, but we'll see.
It's not an argument for a different point. It's an argument in service of just letting you know and asking for your response to the fact that you had municipal officials in Southern California, where there was also a major outbreak beginning in June, July, attributing some degree of responsibility to that outbreak to the protests based on the data that they had. So when you're talking about this medical consensus...
Okay, can you provide me that data?
Sure, I'll provide it for you right now. Just give me 1 second and I'll look it up.
Does it come before or after the data that I provided you? Is it more or less comprehensive?
I will characterize it for you in just 1 second when I find it.
Because in the study I gave you, they specifically called out that previous estimations had failed to take into account certain factors that they had. So this might be one of those.
Okay, here you go. Right. So this is from July 17th. This is in the Los Angeles Times.
Okay.
Corwin Porter, interim public health director for San Bernardino County, said he believes the county is seeing more cases because of, quote, an increase in private gatherings brought on by recent holidays and the onset of summer, the reopening of businesses, protests during June, and less vigilance by individuals and businesses in physical distancing and wearing of face coverings. Okay, so
we just listed the protests offhandedly amongst a dozen other things with what data supporting it?
Well, yeah, according to the county level data that they collect in San Bernardino County, California. Now, you can accuse that public health official who's a Democrat in San Bernardino County of making it up or having an agenda.
But how did he isolate that one variable?
Concluding that. I don't know. You have to ask him. This was reported in the Los Angeles Times.
Okay, wait. Did it claim that he was able to isolate the individual variables, or did he just sort of broadly gesture at a number of things that might be contributing to an uptick? Also, if you could link me that source, I would appreciate it.
Okay, I mean, I'll hold on 1 second. Let me just pull it up. I mean, I don't have his exact methodology offhand, but I do know that California has a relatively expansive contact tracing program. So I would assume that some of that draws from contact tracing results that the county health authority collects.
I mean, possibly. I would have to see it.
Okay, and you know, and you can find other examples of officials.
Okay, but I'm not looking for officials. I'm looking for data.
Well, they're making these claims on the basis of data that they've collected.
Wait, but they're making guesses based on data they've seen. They haven't isolated the variables, which means it's useless.
What doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's useless. And you know, in noting the potential.
A spokeswoman for Riverside County said that officials believe the increases in cases. This is an op-ed. This is just an opinion piece.
An op-ed? It's not an op-ed.
Sorry, I apologize. Not op-ed. It's not an op-ed. I apologize. I misread. But this is an opinion piece. It was stated at the beginning. This is just the belief of individuals.
It's not an opinion. It's not an opinion piece.
Do you know? Wait. Do you know what belief translates to in terms of data? Hypothesis, and then you have to test it.
Okay, so then you could be saying that if you're accusing this interim public health director for San Bernardino County of just spouting off beliefs on the basis of no evidence, that seems like a little bit of a conspiracy theory to me.
No, I'm saying
so maybe you should call him up.
I can't. It's actually insane to me. I don't know if you know you're being dishonest or if this speaks to your journalistic crability. What you have provided me is not the same as what I have provided you. A comprehensive longitudinal study taken from hundreds of cities is not the same thing as one paragraph in a New York Times article where one
the
woman says that different officials believe that it could be caused by a number of things, including protests. This is a ridiculous. You are denigrating the legitimacy of this conversation just by continuing to defend this point. If you would like, in fact, I would like if we can move on. Yes, I am feeling like I am in the clown house right now. I rubber nose.
By citing to you a Los Angeles Times article that quotes a municipal official,
do I need to start putting makeup on?
That's a little odd. I mean, if you want, that might be amusing for the viewers.
Yeah, I'm just trying to fit the food.
I just don't. I think you're radically overstating the ridiculousness.
Massive comprehensive data study. You have one paragraph where they say they believe blank, and they don't even isolate any of the variables.
The study that you keep citing doesn't even conclude what you say it concludes.
It concludes exactly what I say it does. Listen,
no, it
how do you feel?
No,
wait, take away COVID-19. We're in fantasy world. How do you feel about BLM?
How do I feel about BLM?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have a little bit more of a specific question? That's kind of a broad. It's kind of an open. It's like an open-ended essay question almost. I mean,
it'd be easy for me to answer. Angle? I mean, I'm in favor of it. Are you in favor of it?
In favor of it? I mean, it is a very multifaceted thing, right? So when people say that they're in favor of it, you have massive corporations saying they're in favor of it, and then you have radical activists saying they're in favor of it. I'm assuming that those two entities mean different things when they're saying what they're in favor of.
Well, you're a journalist.
That's why I don't find the question to be that illuminating. So that's why I asked you to maybe be a little bit more specific.
Do you think the premises upon which they are protesting are valid? The idea that there is systemic injustice against black people in the United States, and that what they are doing is an effective way of protesting it?
That there is, I think that there is clearly systemic disparities in American society in relation to blacks that goes back centuries, and those disparities often manifest in inequitable treatment of blacks, especially in the criminal justice system. I mean,
so you agree systemic racism
with the drug war being a major culprit of that. Something that I've reported on many times in the past.
So you would agree systemic racism still exists to this day?
I agree that there are racially disparate outcomes in many facets of American society. Why are you avoiding my phrasing? Well, I mean, I'm using my own phrasing. Is that a problem?
So, are the phrasings comparable?
You asked me what I think, so I'm telling you what I think exists.
What is the difference between your phrasing and mine?
I mean, I think it's a little bit more precise. So if you're saying that there are racial disparities in American society, whether in terms of policing or educational outcomes or job opportunities, et cetera, that doesn't necessarily attribute those disparities to, for example, individualized racial animus. I mean, there could be explanations for those disparities other than consciously racist behavior. Some explanations could have to do with consciously racist behavior, but others may not. So that's why the disparities, I think, are worth noting in the way that I just laid out. And disparities that fall along racial lines can be harmful in their own right. So I think it's a perfectly justified way of framing the problem.
Do you think that the disparity between black and white people in this country would be solved if we were to address all class disparities in this country?
I mean, I think that's such a theoretical scenario. It's almost impossible to say. I mean, I think that universal programs involving social expenditure, involving social insurance, et cetera, probably would have a, quote, disproportionately beneficial impact on non-white or black populations insofar as they tend to cluster more disproportionately on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So, yeah, would they disproportionately benefit from those programs? Sure. I think that's a longstanding truism of American public policy. But would that mean does that mean that it would solve every racial inequity in the country? No. I mean, I think that's a little bit.
What racial inequities would it not solve?
What racial inequities would it not solve? Well, I mean, there could be individual people who harbor prejudicial beliefs about others outside their race, that an increase in spending on social services wouldn't necessarily address. So, I mean,
do you think those people are a systemic problem in America?
People who harbor prejudicial beliefs?
Yes.
I mean, to the extent that there are many of them, they probably comprise systems where the net effect of their decisions and behavior could have a systematically deleterious effect on others. So yeah, I would say it's a problem.
All right, I think that's semantically indistinguishable from acknowledging there's systemic racism in this country. So, I mean, I'll take that. We can agree on that one. And how do you feel about the protests? Do you think they're an effective way of addressing this? Would you change their tactics if you could?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to be in a position where I'm dictating tactics to a protest movement. That's sort of not the role that I perceive myself in.
Can I have a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
Yeah, you recently went on Tucker Carlson's show to talk about all of the businesses and people who have been harmed by BLM, all the damage the rioting has done. When you talk about the negative outcomes of BLM and their tactics, it kind of implicitly feels like you're saying they should change their tactics.
Well, I mean, I also thought it was journalistically valid to go to places that saw historic riots on a magnitude that has not occurred since at least the 1960s in the United States, and perhaps before, even going back further, given the geographic scope of the riots. So whatever the ultimate political impact of that journalism, I still felt that there was a journalistic imperative for me to do that.
Do you think it's a little bit coincidental?
Do you think that do you think that was do you think going to places like Minneapolis, where you have entire blocks that are burned and now rubble, do you think that's journalistically valid?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't think there's anything that should be off limits for journalists to cover. I do think it's interesting, though, that you seem to agree with the premises of the Black Lives Matter movement, but as a journalist, your output has been dedicated to attacking the movement in one way or another, whether it be repeatedly criticizing them for the collateral damage that's caused by the rioting, or by saying that we're ruining social distancing. Everything, all the work we've done has been undone by these protests. But I still, even in this conversation, I haven't heard any positive coverage of BLM from you. Like, not a positive word, like I support them or what they're doing is good.
Okay, I'll give you one. I'll give you a positive right now. I mean, there was a resolution. I have to look this up specifically, but I believe in June there was a resolution introduced in the U.S. Senate. Hold on, give me 1 second. I can look it up really quickly. Okay, so there was actually a bipartisan act introduced on June 11th. Called the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act in the U.S. Senate, which would prohibit no-knock warrants, which is the type of law enforcement activity that led to the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, where I actually just was a few days ago. And to me, that's a very proper legislative response, and so I applaud whoever had a hand in creating that, and I tweeted about it at the time. So, I have no issue mentioning what I perceive to be beneficial policy changes as a result of increased societal awareness around police excesses. I've been a critic of U.S. police culture for years, many of which I think much of which enables excess force, corruption, and an overly punitive societal approach. So you're in favor of social problems.
BLM because the advocacy they've engaged in has led to, among other things, the push for this legislation?
I mean, I don't think it's a matter of me being in favor or opposed. Like, I don't understand why it has to necessarily be looked at in that binary.
This is why people sometimes accuse you of being a weasel. Because everyone, even journalists, have political biases, and acknowledging those biases is an important part of allowing viewers to recognize your right. Yeah. But you're not, because you're not taking a stand on this. You're not condemning or appraising them, but you are writing articles saying the BLM protests have done tremendous damage or are going to do tremendous damage. But you don't say they're bad.
But in order to acknowledge a bias, I mean, I've just laid out to you a number of my different views that have something to do with BLM. So and that sheds additional light onto what my journalistic angle may be on a particular subject, and then people can take that into account when they read it or watch it.
Let me provide an example.
I don't think being upfront or being forthright about my bias necessarily requires me to declare that I, quote, support or oppose a very sprawling and multidimensional protest movement that to me doesn't even lend itself to that kind of.
It's about the implication. Like, imagine I ask you, how do you feel about gay people? And you go, I like Freddie Mercury. And then you go out and you write 5 articles on the damage that the LGBT community is doing to America. And then I bring you back on. You're like, well, I don't. Gay people, that's so vague. Like, am I pro or anti-gay people? They're just people, you know? I guess,
which is kind of true. I mean, I like some gay people and I dislike other gay people.
But but the problem is what I just did was I gave you an example of an anti-gay journalist who was weaselly in that they wouldn't take any credit for their anti-LGBT positions.
Hold on. You've just acknowledged that you found it to be journalistically legitimate to go to places that underwent serious rioting and talk to people who were affected, including small business owners, minorities, recent immigrants, who, by the way, are largely Democratic constituencies, but whose views haven't really been represented in popular media narratives. Because, the one way, I don't know if you've read all my articles, but I've mentioned this in a couple. One way that I sort of characterize their political sentiments, and this, I'm thinking of definitely Minneapolis, St. Paul, but also other places like Chicago, Milwaukee, Seattle, etc. They tend to be sort of small c conservative in their cultural and political attitudes, but they're still Democrats. They're not pro-Trump. They don't have any affinity with the Republican Party.
Being represented?
But many of the people for whom the riots / protests were experienced as a profound personal tragedy that threatened their personal safety and the safety of their children. Like, I talked to a man in Minneapolis who I just kind of came across randomly. I didn't even really purposely seek out these people, but they're just so widespread and so easy to find that they were impossible to miss, who is a Somali immigrant who, when the riots occurred, he had to deal with largely, this is according to him, this is not me, this is him, largely white, black-clad anarchists coming into his neighborhood in Minneapolis, lighting shit on fire and threatening to burn down his building that he lived in with children.
Okay.
And he had to go plead with them not to burn it down. So when
the thing is, we're doing it again.
He's not pro-Trump.
So the thing is, we're doing it again. Nobody in America is pro burning down apartment blocks with children. So when you say this guy's political position isn't being represented by BLM, what you're kind of implying is that BLM is pro burning down apartment blocks.
I'm not implying that.
Okay.
I'm saying you asked me for an example of the type of person whose sentiments are not generally reflected in popular media narratives.
Wait, he's anti-arson. Everyone's anti-arson.
Well, not everyone, not the revolutionary anarchists who committed arson attacks.
Wait. You can't. Wait. You realize what you just did there, right? You see that little pivot? You just said these people's positions aren't being represented in major media, and now you're trying to suggest that major media position is pro-arson. What are you talking about?
No, I'm not.
You
I'm not suggesting that. You're attributing to me a suggestion that I didn't make at all.
Well, you just said, and pardon me if I misremember.
So you said no one's in favor of arson. I mean, I would assume that the people who committed arson attacks are in favor of arson.
Well, generally, no. I mean, people who kill aren't always pro-murder. Usually, most people are anti-murder conceptually.
Wait, so you think that people who intentionally set fire to buildings can't be said to be in favor of arson?
Wait, no. I'm saying it's though that's a political position that the person whose house nearly was burnt down isn't being represented by is ridiculous. The Democrats are losing the modern immigrant left. They're pro-arson, and the non-woke lefties won't follow them.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are people who have reservations about the protest movement, given their experience with the protest movement, which to them resulted in mass damage. And yet, who are not conservatives, who are not pro-Trump, who are not Republicans.
But what reservations?
They exist in this sort of ideological no man's land where they don't bolster the agenda of either party very neatly. So they don't get their sentiments don't tend to be reflected very much in popular media narratives.
What reservations? That they're anti-arson?
That to them, the Black Lives, and these are largely non-whites. So again, I'm just relaying to you what I was told.
I mean, I don't care what the ethnicity of these people are. I'm not. You don't need.
I sort of do. I think it's sort of instructive what their ethnicity is, given that we're reducing so much to the nature of people's racial identity.
What reservations?
So,
apart from the arson,
well,
I'll grant you that arson is bad, but apart from that, what
reservations in that you have an impoverished man who's disabled in North Minneapolis, who is in a wheelchair, who told me that in the wake of the protests, he can't go down to the grocery store where he gets basic amenities anymore. So that's how he experienced the protest. He's not an activist. He didn't participate in the protests. So
do you think that represents like a large demographic of people who are being left behind by the political messaging of BLM? I'm pretty sure if you asked most BLM protesters, they would say that's fucked up. We should get somebody to engage in some mutual aid and maybe get that guy his groceries.
Perhaps so, and good for them if that's what they choose to do.
But then this isn't about political positions being left behind. This is just about massive protests hurting people, and that does hurt people. Okay,
I agree that it does hurt people, and I think the people that were hurt. I mean, when I went around into Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I'm not pivoting. I'm just explaining to you sort of where I'm coming from here. I went around and did something relatively simple, which is that I spent like 10 days going and talking to business owners and residents whose lives were totally upended by the protests/riots. And I don't think that you can draw a neat distinction between the two necessarily, given that they all happened at the same moment. And when I did a Twitter thread and when I've done art,
in most cities, the riots were only the first few days. Yeah, but just to be clear, in most cities, the riots either didn't happen or were only in the first few days. The only cities where the rioting is continuing are cities like Portland, where there are literal, like, ongoing fights between the state and the people.
That's generally right. I'm talking about that first week or so in late May, early June, when you had the major eruption of activity. So yeah, that's right. But I went around, 3 weeks later, roughly, and just did very simple, straightforward reportage. I'm not saying I'm a unbelievably talented investigative reporter or anything. This is really commonsensical, and just sort of documented their stories. Did a big Twitter thread, uploaded some stuff to YouTube, wrote a few articles, and I can't tell you how many hundreds of people across the political spectrum, not just conservatives. Yes, there were many, but liberals and leftists who contacted me privately saying, "Oh my God, I had no idea that the protests /riots had this kind of severe impact on the local, largely non-white communities in Minneapolis, St. Paul." So when I say that the people who are, quote, hurt by the protests haven't really had their perspective represented in national media narratives, that's what I'm talking about. That's a serious discrepancy for which you can assign explanations that have to do with the fact that so many journalists and activists are invested personally in the public image of this movement, and therefore that could guide their coverage decisions. And that's not a conspiratorial. That's not positing a conspiracy. That's just natural human behavior.
First of all, I don't buy this shit that nobody was covering the riots or covering the damage done to the communities. For the first couple of weeks, the only major coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests were people talking about how Minneapolis was burning. That what the discourse was dominated by this perspective. So the idea that all the news media people are conspiratorially only talking about the positive end no, that's ridiculous. There has been plenty of light brought to that. I don't have anything against talking about these issues, by the way, but can you understand how, in light of your apparent inability to say you support BLM and your constant coverage of things that give bad light to BLM, you're effectively pragmatically taking an identical position to somebody who is anti-BLM? I mean, this is. I just want to say here one last thing.
I think what I'm doing is covering aspects of BLM that haven't received due attention, in part by talking to working class people who have a different outlook on the movement than one that you generally find if you consume popular
the overwhelming
media, including social media narrative.
The overwhelming majority of people of color
results in me.
The overwhelming majority of people of color in this country do support Black Lives Matter. For Black people, it's something like 85% support, and then there's like a neutral zone before you even get to the opposition.
Sure, but I think part of what happened. That's why when you initially asked me the binary yes or no question, do I support it? I hesitated because I find it to be very reductive and oversimplified. because part of the Black Lives Matter protest movement and a main reason why it became so prominent is because of the extreme riotous activity that happened in that first week or so after the George Floyd
That's what you
death.
got to do. Got to do what you got to do.
Okay, so I mean, if you support that, fine, but I'm not going to just give you a blithe yes or no answer. Well, so you don't support things like burning down businesses and
no, not at all. But unfortunately, our news media only gives attention to protests if those protests get rowdy. It's unfortunate, but they learned the same thing back during the civil rights movement.
You just said you got to do what you got to do. So what did you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that our news media is literally unwilling to cover civil rights struggles unless things get feisty. That's one of the reasons why there's been so much coverage of Portland, for example, and Seattle to a lesser extent. It's not because that's where the majority of the protests are happening. The actual number of people out there in the streets of Portland are infinitesimal compared to the peaceful protesters that are walking across the rest of the country. The reason, unfortunately, is because people want to see blood, and what Martin Luther King Jr. recognized and Malcolm X recognized back during the civil rights movement is the duality of rioting and protests that brings the greatest level of attention to injustice. It's unfortunate, that doesn't mean the rioting is a good thing. I would agree with that,
but if to use your phrase, you got to do what you got to do. If what you quote got to do is, for example, burn down a minority business or smash up a post office.
What if it led to police reform? Wait, what if it led to police reform all across the country?
Are you in favor of or do you think that's something you quote gotta do?
I'm a utilitarian, so it would depend on the outcome. So, for example, if you burnt a few buildings,
well, I mean, given the outcomes that are evident as of today, August 10th, like, do you think you gotta do that?
Well, we're only like 2 months into a historic protest. But if, for example, the damage done by the BLM protests ended up leading to police reform or to a radical restructuring of our criminal justice system, or hell, even made it more likely that Biden won over Trump, then yes, I would consider all of those things absolutely a worthwhile outcome. Can I ask you one thing?
Okay, I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid perspective to have. So.
All right, thank you. My one issue that I have though is like what you've said to me right here is you've kind of given the impression of somebody who recognizes the complexities of the BLM protesters and doesn't want to commit to like a dualistic yes, no, good, bad answer. But you're and
just to interject very briefly, I mean, I wouldn't even say that with regard to like Joe Biden. I don't even think I have to have a dualistic yes or no answer in terms of do you support Joe Biden, even if I might have a preference for Biden to win, or you can even like say the same thing of Trump or in 2016 during the election or any number of phenomena. I think it just doesn't lend itself to that kind of dualistic, that's a good word, rendering of the moral nature of the situation.
My main issue is that right now you're trying to paint somebody who's not necessarily neutral, but at the very least nuanced. But the issue is you're lying to me because you've characterized BLM protesters in the past. On May 30th, you called them self-indulgent left-wing identity grievance rallies. And on the 20th of July, you said that the idea that you could call the BLM protests a working-class uprising is beyond hilarious unless white suburban moms in yoga pants and 20-something trans activists are now considered tribunes of the working class. So this idea... So if we're to bring out like all your coverage of BLM... You have misrepresented scientific data on their propensity for spreading COVID-19.
I haven't misrepresented the scientific
exclusively
data.
Covered.
If I may, hold on. And then I read the conclusion of the study that totally contradicted how you had depicted it. So you misrepresented that.
I don't have time to explain study literacy to you, but I promise you that article agreed with everything that I said.
I simply read the abstract, and it totally...
You don't praise BLM, but you do talk about the damage done in its wake, and you characterize BLM protesters as being white suburbanites, trans activists, suburban moms, and other groups such as that. I mean, your coverage of this seems to indicate a pretty overwhelmingly negative and patronizing view towards BLM. I'm a prideful man. I don't like being lied to.
You just accuse me of how am I lying? How am I stating
wait, Michael, I'll give you can do.
Because lying is consciously stating a falsehood.
You're lying or you're a massive weasel. You refuse to commit to anything, but all of your language outside the context of you clarifying your points.
Okay, so I'm happy to continue. Hold on, I'm happy to continue this conversation, but part of what I said initially was that
presumption of good faith. I agree completely. So are you willing to engage in good faith and not lie to me?
I'm happy to engage in good faith, but when you accuse me of lying, when I'm being as honest as possible with you right now, that seems to me to veer into bad faith because I'm not lying. I'll happily explain to you both claims in those tweets you cited. In terms of the suburban white yoga mom thing, yeah, that was a flippant, semi-dismissive characterization because I have been to suburban protests, which was a major component of this movement. That's why it was so big, because it was so widely distributed amongst different kinds of geographic areas that you wouldn't normally expect protests to happen in. So I attended certain protests that occurred in heavily white suburban areas.
And
guess who the
20-something
major
trans
demographic
activists as well.
Well, I think when you have the entire month of June was largely dedicated to the notion of Black trans lives, and that is
It was dedicated to a number of things.
It was dedicated to a number of things, but that was a major aspect of it. I think you'd agree. And when you have just these casual surmises that the protesters are automatically tribunes of working class sentiment, and yet one of their major points of emphasis is a relatively niche subject like Black trans lives. You can support Black trans lives rights, protections, whatever, but I think you have to acknowledge that it's a relatively niche subject.
What's the incompatibility there?
I'm not saying it's incompatibility.
Most trans people are working class.
Many, I'm sure that's largely correct. The question is whether they are tribunes of the mass, broad-based working class, and I don't think that Black trans lives or the protection thereof is necessarily a highly animating working class concern, especially in relation to the pandemic, which I think is a working class concern. This is what's so interesting. This is sort of
Why
what
are trans issues not a working class concern? If trans issues aren't, then certainly Black issues aren't as well.
I'm not saying they're not a working class concern amongst some segments of the working class. The issue is whether Black trans lives protesters are, quote, tribune, meaning they're broadly representative of the sentiments of the working class as it's widely understood to exist
Black
in the
Lives
United
Matter
States.
protest is largely about progressivism, social equality, and usually, I mean, at least right now, trans people are kind of the canary in the coal mine. They're the forefront of the progressive discourse, and usually testing people's opinions on trans people.
They're the forefront of the progressive discourse. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what you do. Back in the 1980s, it was gay people as well, and back in the 1960s, it was women and Black people, and at a time before that, it was it's different groups, the Irish, the Italians, and the reason we do that is because usually these people are a very good litmus test for the relative level of bigotry and partisanship on the part of the people who are fighting against those civil rights. So right now, if a person is, say, for example, against transgenderism, as they often call it, that usually means they're not a particularly good luminary for progressive issues, whether or not there are many trans people in this country.
I mean, that's sort of a conceptual discussion. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with the premise. It depends how you define progressivism. If you define progressivism as increased social provision to disadvantaged communities, I don't know that beliefs on the ethics or propriety of trans issues is necessarily the best indicator of how they feel, for example.
Then you would have to say the same thing about gay people.
Perhaps so. I mean, I think they're sort of they're separate domains of issues.
No, I would say that being a progressive pretty neatly puts you in the same ballpark of being supportive of gay and trans people. I don't know what definition of progressive would leave you outside of that. I
mean, there's nothing inherent about trans issues, for example, that would necessitate you to then express support for single-payer healthcare, right? I mean, I think it's pretty
progressivism isn't just supporting single-payer healthcare. It's about supporting equality amongst minority groups.
I'm naming one example of an issue that is generally thought of as a benchmark of progressive sentiment in the United States. Would you agree that single-payer healthcare is one of them?
One of them, but not all of them. Also fighting back against Mike Pence and his, anti-LGBT agenda, back when he was not the vice president. That was also a bastion of progressive activism.
The point is that I don't think that
there's no definition of progressivism that doesn't include these groups.
Okay, I mean, that may be so, given the contemporary definition of progressivism. However, I don't think that there's anything inherent about being in favor of increased social provision and of being against oligarchy, against concentration of power in the tech sector, in the energy sector, in the financial sector, that intrinsically necessitates one to then be a stalwart activist on behalf of Black trans lives.
You just wouldn't be a progressive. Yeah, you could be other things. You could be in favor of this or that.
How would you define how would you characterize a person ideologically who, for example, is in favor of breaking up the banks and single-payer healthcare and free universal public college, that sort of thing, but has what you might call a bit more of a traditional take on trans lives? Not that they're actively hostile to trans, but they aren't necessarily an adherent to the dominant form of trans.
A class reductionist
ideology, I guess. Okay, but
certainly not a progressive. No. If anyone legitimately believes they have any place in the left saying that they care about stuff like single-payer healthcare and better infrastructural investment, but then they're just going to leave minority groups out in the cold, no, of course they're not on the left. They can be
I don't think
interested economically in greater liberation for American citizens. Sure, fine, but certainly not a progressive.
Well, I mean, leaving out in the cold, I don't think it would be fair to say that in not adhering to the dominant forms of trans ideology or activism right now, it necessarily means that you want to leave them out in the cold.
We can talk about your beliefs if you like. We don't have to dance around the hypothetical. I know you're not too keen on trans ideology, as you say it.
It's not that I'm keen. Okay, I mean, you have a specific. I'll answer whatever question you have.
Are trans women women?
Are trans women women? If that's how they identify, then I personally, from my own personal perspective, I'd be happy to honor their requests in terms of what they would like to be perceived as by society. Sure.
So you'd humor them.
I would humor them.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would put it that way. I mean, I would respect their wishes.
But would they be women?
For all intents and purposes, in terms of how I treat them, yes.
But that's not the same as saying they're women. That's just saying you'd treat them like women.
If I treat you as a woman and I regard you as a woman, then in terms of your interactions with me, you're a woman. I don't really get the distinction.
So imagine if I ask you, do you think black people are people? And you say, well, I'll treat them like people. What do you think that would suggest about your opinions towards black people? It would be that they're kind of not people, right? That's what you're doing right now. Dancing around the answer doesn't make your position any more nuanced. It just takes longer for me to get at your actual idea.
I don't think that I'm dancing around the issue. I think I'm answering it pretty concretely.
So you don't think they're women, but you'll treat them functionally like women because it's sort of greater social utility in doing so.
Well, I mean, when you say that trans women are women, what do you mean exactly? Can you define that a little further, and then I'll tell you if I agree.
What is a woman?
I'm asking you.
Oh,
I mean, you're posing the question to me, so I'm asking you to sort of define your terms.
Yeah, but I only need them to fit within your definition of woman. We can have different definitions, but still respect trans people and their identities. So I need your definition of what a woman is.
My definition of a woman, I would think that, again, this seems to, I would more ask you to, because obviously the definition of a woman, if I have to tell you how I define a woman, then clearly it means something beyond what chromosomes you're born with.
Is that what you think a woman is?
No, not necessarily. Not in terms of how I deal with people in the real world. No. I mean, if a trans woman presents as a woman, then I am perfectly fine with that. I don't see how that's dancing around the issue or evading
right, but
what you're posing to me, especially if I'm asking you to define your terms here.
So is Tulsi Gabbard a woman?
Is Tulsi Gabbard a woman? Yeah, I mean, she presents as a woman, sure.
Okay, wait. So you just answered with yes immediately. When I ask you if a trans woman is a woman, I hear 5 minutes of tap dancing. So there's obviously a difference between how, like...
I don't think that there's a difference because, I mean, trans woman is a sort of a, I don't know, it's a newer category of what it means to be a woman. And,
and I'm asking I think
denigrating people for saying, I will treat everybody with respect, I will honor their preferences in terms of how they present to the world. with these sort of bizarre interrogation style questions, I don't see how that advances.
Well, I don't, wait, but I'm not. It's not a bizarre
movement.
interrogation. I mean, I'm just asking like over and over the same question, and you keep not answering it in more and more creative ways. So you immediately said yes with Tulsi. I acknowledge the fact that a trans woman doesn't necessarily compile to every pre-existing understanding of what we thought woman meant 10, 20, 30, 100 years ago.
This is why I asked you to define your terms rather than just kind of asking
well, to me,
this.
a woman would be anyone who identifies as a woman, and they would be just as much a woman as anyone who identified as one and was born with XX chromosomes.
If a woman is anybody who identifies as a woman, then I agree.
Okay. Just as much so as anyone born regardless of their chromosomes?
I mean, in terms of how society interacts with them,
I only have so
then
many teeth of my
yes.
own to pull. I'm running out here. I got my wisdom
I
tooth
mean,
removed.
do you think that a woman who is born with male genitalia, but then transitions to a woman later on in life,
Mhm.
if I say that they're a woman, which I agree with in terms of their societal presentation, are in every 100% the same as every other woman who was born with different chromosomes.
I mean, no woman is
I don't know.
100% the same to any other woman, but I'd say they're both the same
Well,
amount
they're
of
the
woman.
same in terms of the chromosomes they're born with.
Sure, but there are women who have different heights. That's biological. Even cis women have
Sure.
different heights. So yeah, they're the same in the sense that they're both equally women, but they have other characteristics that are different, like having a penis or having a vagina. Like there are some women who are tall and some women who are short, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just don't see the ultimate point of this line of inquiry here. I mean, what are you trying to elicit in me? That I have some kind of animus towards trans? I mean, I don't. I'm telling you that I would treat everybody in my personal life with the utmost of respect and honor their wishes. So, I mean, what's the ultimate point of this line of inquiry?
Well, the segue kind of came from one of the tweets that you made where you referred to 20-something trans activists not being tribunes of the working class, which is an interesting position to take. And it seems, well, it depends on what you mean by tribune and working class for that matter. I would say that tribunes of the working class would be anyone who shares the working class experience, and that the working class tribune roster should be diverse, because to pretend that the representatives of the working class are only white men is to erase the fact
I don't
that
pretend that.
Well, I know. But so we should, ideally the lineup of the tribunes of the working class should be, we have, people of all shapes and colors and what have you. And that would include 20-something trans activists, because many of them are, in fact, working class. But yeah, I was just curious for your opinion on that.
Sure. I mean, the point in my composing that tweet, if I'm remembering correctly, it was, I think I quote tweeted something, if I'm not mistaken, which basically, I mean, do you have it in front of you? I mean,
yes, the quote you tweeted was, "White people who ostensibly consider themselves to be on the left are watching a working class uprising that crosses racial lines, and they're losing their minds that they're more or less irrelevant to it." And I agree with that. I think there's an effort on the part of a lot of people to reduce working class struggle to just white men. This is usually from people who like to consider themselves left-leaning, but really just, I don't know, browse stupid poll and spend a lot of time on Twitter. The working class movement has always been multiracial in this country and in all countries.
Sure. I mean, it would have to be in the United States. It's a multiracial society.
I would hope so.
I guess the idea is, if you see a Black Trans Lives Movement protest in June, when the entire month of June was essentially devoted to this because it happened to coincide with Pride Month, right? And your immediate supposition is that 20 and 30 some, teenage and 20 and 30 something, largely white activists who are brandishing Black Trans Lives Matter signage and putting the concept of Black trans lives at the forefront of their progressive agenda. If your immediate takeaway from that is that these people are tribunes of the wider American,
I don't think anyone. You brought up tribune. Nobody else said tribune.
Yeah, I did bring up tribune.
Yeah, so
because that's sort of what was being implied. I thought.
No, I think it was just saying that these are working class movements. Yeah, there aren't a lot of bourgeois getting out there and running out into the streets to protest.
That's not. I think there are a lot of bourgeois getting involved in this.
By bourgeois, I don't mean wealthy.
Part of why it became so prominent.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, because for example, Ross Baraka, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with him at all? He's
I've heard.
Okay, he's the son of a prominent black thinker and writer, and he's the mayor of Newark. Mm-hmm. And he recently dismissed the notion of defunding the police as a bourgeois liberal idea that has no relevance in terms of his predominantly black city.
Wait, the mayor dismissed the idea of abolishing the police as bourgeois,
defunding
the police as bourgeois and liberal.
Yes, he did.
Interesting.
And I think he, and this is obviously the black mayor, and I think he's onto something in the sense that there is a major facet of these protests that have been bourgeois and liberal, which are sort of fuzzy terms, I grant. But if you go to so many protests I've been to, you can tell that there's sort of affluent. There's a major presence of affluent liberals who have made common cause with a wide range of other interests, obviously, such as insurrectionary anarchists. Then you have sort of normie Dems. You have socialists. No, I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm just being descriptive. But I
don't think that makes it a bourgeois movement.
I think there is a bourgeois component to it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have some. I mean, if the movement wasn't at least in some sense conducive to bourgeois liberal interests, do you think you would have had so many massive corporations rush to proclaim their solidarity with it if they felt it to be a threat to them? Am I a socialist?
Yeah, you're using bourgeois. I'm not. I wasn't under the impression you were a socialist.
Oh, but I thought. Well, because it's. I don't think you need to be a socialist in order to use the term bourgeois. I mean, you can have a class.
I agree. I'm just curious.
And didn't you bring up that word initially?
Yeah, because I am a socialist. I'm
okay. So I'm happy to use your terminology then.
Okay, fine. Just curious. So you were saying, I don't want to seem like I'm evading your question. I don't identify as a socialist. If I were to identify with something, it would be more, I don't know, ecumenical left something. Not where I don't, in terms of where I would be happy to be a member of a coalition that was socialist dominated, for example. But in terms of my individual self-conception, so I don't self-identify as a socialist. All right, that's fine. So first of all, the fact that there are affluent white protesters mixed in quite a few of these rallies makes sense because college students have always been, at least over the past 60 or 70 years, like a very strong backbone of progressive protest movements in this country. Back during the 1960s, of course, we had the civil rights protests, which, while obviously largely dominated by black people, were supported heavily in large part by those groups. Likewise with the end of the war movements in Vietnam. And with regards to the corporations throwing out to support BLM, they're not doing it because BLM is a bourgeois liberal movement. They're doing it because those corporations know the majority of the population supports BLM, so they can just cash in on some free fucking publicity by aligning themselves with a movement most people seem to like. But I don't think that delegitimizes the movement in any way.
Oh, no, I don't argue that it delegitimizes it necessarily. I think it's a component of it, and I think to deny the presence of what you might call bourgeois liberal sentiments in driving the movement is to just deny what made a major part of what made the movement so prominent.
Well, I don't deny there are liberal elements that are driving the movement, but not bourgeois. I do reject that idea. But of course, most of those people are liberals. Most Americans are liberals. I think it's arguable.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely plausible to me to say that there is a bourgeois component of the protest movement. Whether it's
but in what? How are they serving corporate interests?
To define it. How are they serving corporate interests?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if Apple or Google can emblazon their products with Black Lives Matter and then in hopes of garnering additional profits, I mean, that shows that.
But that doesn't mean the protests are
movement,
bourgeois. That just means that the companies are profiting off the existence of the BLM protests could be like literal all anarchists, and there would still be corporations making money off merchandise from it. I don't think that makes the movement bourgeois. That just means the bourgeois will always find ways to monetize.
Well, if Google or Apple employees partake in the protests, literally, like they attend protests, they help organize them, which has occurred. If I'm not mistaken.
Bourgeois.
Then what? Then so if they're like say managers of the company.
I mean, that wouldn't make it a bourgeois movement necessarily.
No, but it means that there's a bourgeois component.
No, that then you could say then that there's like a 6'8" component because a 6'8" guy went to a protest. When we talk about components to a movement, we're talking about the driving ideological interests of the movement, not like is a rich person there or is a bourgeois person there or something like that. I think like we have to be specific with this language because there are people like those fucks at the Rising, Sauger and Crystal and what have you, who constantly
What's your problem with the Rising?
They're next. Who constantly delegitimize BLM by pretending that that BLM is in some way this corporate stooge movement, that if it was actually radical, then it wouldn't be being supported by all these big corporations, which is an idiotic argument for a number of reasons. First of all, as Marx wrote, the capital interests of the owner class will always seek to commodify the political discourse of the era. So it wouldn't matter what the ideological disposition of the movement was, it will always be taken advantage of by corporations of that era. And secondly, the idea...
I think that's right.
Okay, yeah. Well, in that case, like everything is and is not bourgeois, depending on how popular it becomes. But meaningfully speaking, I don't think BLM serves the interests of corporations. I think that for the most part, it has been a good civil rights and a good working class movement. I hope that it
can I ask you? Maybe this will be more of an illuminating question. I mean, do you think that BLM granting how multifarious it is and hard to sort of pin down, which again goes back to why I didn't want to answer your first question there in terms of the binary yes or no. Mm-hmm. I mean, but do you think that it threatens the interests of major corporations like, for example, Apple or Google?
Yes, I would say so. To an extent.
How
the
so?
More radical elements, yes.
How so?
Well, the majority of BLM is liberal-leaning, and I acknowledge that, and liberals
So that's the driving force, then, if it's the majority, right?
Well, it's one of the driving forces, but there's also a pretty substantial radical driving force that's pushing for stuff like police and prison abolition. And police are, at least in the socialist framework, the watchdogs of the capital class. They're the people whose job primarily is to preserve the property relations of any given state. So by abolishing the police, or by even reducing their relative power in society, what you're essentially doing is you're thinning the protective lining for the bourgeois. You're reorganizing society to deprioritize the protection of private property. And I would argue that is absolutely a challenge to the material interests of the bourgeois. Now, not every BLM protester is out here protesting for abolishing the police, and I respect and recognize that. But there are people who are, and the idea has gotten quite a bit of traction. 5 years ago, can you imagine the BLM protests back then? Somebody saying abolish the police, nobody would have taken that seriously. Now it's an actual conversation. I think that's wonderful.
I mean, I think you're right in terms of the discursive trajectory of the police. You know, I recently looked at a couple of tweets that I put out in the summer of 2016 when there was remember there was a shooting in Dallas where 4 or 5 police officers were killed.
Oh, I remember the crazed BLM guy, right? A while back.
Yeah. I don't know if he was a BLM guy or not. I mean, who knows? But
whatever.
I think he might have attended a protest or something. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it was clear that to me was a turning point in the police being quote unquote centered as the main driver of culture war animosities in the United States, having supplanted things like gay marriage or even to some extent abortion. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it has become so prominent is definitely something that's notable and should be theorized out. I'm just sort of, which to say I largely agree with what you just laid out there. But I don't know that I think it's important to recognize the moving parts within the movement, because yes, I mean, I have spoken to people who have a defund the police sign, and I asked them what they mean by that, and they say abolish the police. Whereas you'll have others who say, oh, defund the police means just take some of the money we allocate to police in the municipal budget and give it to social workers.
It's probably the most realistic, immediate solution, I'd say.
Right, and if that's the dominant strain within BLM, then I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that it threatened the interest of like an Apple, because the police are going to not be able to insulate like Tim Cook or something from a popular uprising if they're
it's not just about the literal revolutionary aspect here. It's about shifting the police's priorities from the protection of property to the protection of human lives. Right now, the reason we dedicate so many resources to the police, we don't do this to help human. How many people have filed a police report and gotten nothing back in return? No. The police exist mostly to make sure wealth stays where it's supposed to be. And deprioritizing that, I think, is an essential step in aligning people's material interests more solidly against those of the bourgeois. But whatever the case may be, it's a very gradual process. I don't think the movement has like bourgeois tendencies. Liberal tendencies I'll acknowledge. But frankly, there's nothing inherently radical about arguing that we live in a society that has been beset by systemic racism since its inception, and something needs to be done about it. So if the liberals want to have their fun fixing racism, then God bless them. And I'll be out there in the street with them too, as much as liberal discourse often impedes leftist activism. I'd say that's a pretty good track they've set themselves on.
Okay. I mean, I'll take that as a comment on your part.
Yeah.
I think, some of what you say is correct.
We've feel like I've held you up here for quite a while, and I apologize for that. Do you want to?
Hey, I signed up for this.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, by the way. Do you want to hit on any final points or like final memes before we head out?
Final memes? Are there memes that I've neglected? I don't know.
There's always a few to bring up.
One point that I was in the process of making that I think sort of gets to why I covered and analyzed the protest from the perspective of the social distancing / virus issue is because in my discussions with lots of normal people, what's at top of mind for them, this is working class people overwhelmingly, is the virus / pandemic. It's part of the reason why Donald Trump's reelection prospects have been severely diminished, because the federal response has, correctly in my view, seemed to be extremely lackluster. And so for the protests to have been carried out with such little regard for the societal compact that had been brokered in relation to the pandemic, which involved not mass gathering. I mean, if you want to argue that the protests had negligible or no effect on the virus spread, okay, but it's impossible to argue that they contravened the societal guidance that had been widely adhered to in the preceding 3 months with regard to mass gatherings. And to me, the pandemic has hit the working class disproportionately hard, including minorities, by the way. And so I just feel like the tension there between having a protest movement about that emphasize things like Black trans lives that are counter to the protocols that had been in place in terms of mitigating a pandemic, that tension to me there had been very much elided or glossed over in the rush on so many people's part, including many in the media and the academic and even in the technocratic or public health worlds, to imbue the movement with this sort of like sacrosanct, unimpeachable moral stature.
I think we have to change that perception. You should write an article about how actually there's no evidence to suggest that the protests are leading to an uptick in COVID-19 cases, and maybe those people will feel a bit better about it then. They should actually, the BLM protesters are like their saviors, because they seem to be decreasing the spread wherever they go by encouraging everyone else to stay home.
So, I mean, so do you think that, from the outset of the pandemic, So, in other words, the prohibition on mass gatherings was misguided. We should have never had a prohibition on mass gatherings in the first place.
Oh no, we should have.
We should have. Why?
Well, wait. Of what size? Sorry, I don't mean. Do you mean like a backyard gathering, or I should be?
Let's say 50 or 100 or more people.
Yeah, like canceling concerts and stuff like that. Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah, concerts, conventions, big meetups, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think it's fine to cancel those.
And for what reason? Like, why is it good to cancel them?
Well, many of those things are indoors, which exponentially
let's say
multiplies the likelihood.
let's say like a music festival that's outdoors or something.
Oh, because there's a decent chance of a greater degree of COVID-19 contraction in that area.
Okay, and that same logic couldn't be applied to protests. How? It's the same logic.
Because there's a difference between a music concert and an unprecedented civil rights uprising.
Not in terms of their propensity to spread the virus. I mean, you might feel that one has far more moral purchase than the other, which is valid, but not in terms. I mean, the virus has no regard for the rightness or wrongness of the cause that
the
you're
protests
advocating.
Also encourage other people to stay at home because they don't want to get bricked. So that seems to have a net neutral effect. I mean, because if you have like a concert, no one else's days and commutes are being affected by that concert, except for the people getting stuff in traffic on the way there, I suppose. But when it comes to BLM protests, people don't go outside. They want to stay safe, so they don't go and, I don't know, go to the glory hole town or wherever the fuck they were doing to contract COVID-19 that they didn't get to go to because of the protests.
Okay, I mean, and just to kind of finish off that point, I was trying to mention something about Houston and Austin earlier, just in terms of the chronology of the virus spread there. And I don't, for a minute, deny that there are a multitude of factors which probably contributed to the virus spread, one of which was a premature reopening, largely undertaken by Republican governors, and just sort of individual aversion, especially in the South and West, to mask wearing, which I think thankfully now has subsided somewhat. The lackluster federal response, as I mentioned, Trump's refusal to wear a mask really in public at all until relatively recently. So many factors there. But I think to deny that the protest could have been one factor among many is almost delusional. I mean, I would almost feel it was more honest if people said, hey, this may have contributed to virus spread, but nonetheless, we support it. At least then we're
the
on
strongest argument in your favor is that
footing.
The strongest argument in your favor is that there's no data for or against the BLM protests contributing to the increase in COVID-19 spread in Texas during that time. That's the strongest argument. The counter argument I could make is that I have
California,
data.
There is data.
Well, no. You gave me one lady saying that the people who she works for thinks that there may be a number of reasons why COVID-19 is upticked, which is not data. And you think that lady
was saying that on the basis of zero data? I mean,
I think that I would need to see data that indicates that factor had been isolated, because it literally sounded like she was repeating verbatim a list of possible causes given to her by her superiors.
Okay, and I'm looking it up now, but I do believe.
Wait, we did this at the beginning. We're horseshoe theorying this conversation.
And also in July, we did this in the beginning. And also, just for the record, though, I mean, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, did say that he believed that there was a connection between the virus outbreak and protests, and he expressed that belief on the basis of data.
I believe he's a giant cuck, and I want to see that data, because he's probably wrong. Okay. There are a lot of people out there who don't know how to read data properly.
Okay. And was there an additional point that I had wanted to make? No, I think that's probably about it. But this is I guess all that is to say that my emphasis on this wasn't to attack BLM. Like earlier, you kind of characterized my posture toward BLM as just to simply quote attack. I don't know
if you're going to move me on this one.
But I having myself lived at the epicenter of the pandemic, where I did lockdown for 6 weeks to 2 months or so, as did so many others, having people in my social networks who were affected in it. The principal at a middle school that I went to in New Jersey died suddenly from COVID. I did think that it was important to abide by a societal compact in service of mitigating a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And when Republicans violated that compact, I've been vocal about it. And when the left, violated in some sense, the compact. I think it's also necessary to be vocal about it, or at least be honest about it in terms of the trade-offs, which was not forthcoming, I found, much of the time.
Sure,
That was sort of my perspective.
Of BLM has just exclusively been in the service of right-leaning perspectives. Like, I'm a consequentialist. I don't actually care what's going up in your skull. It doesn't matter to me, nor should you care what's going on in my skull. The only thing that matters is what we do and what the effects of those actions are. So for you to denigrate BLM protesters, saying they're all suburban white anarchists, whatever.
I didn't say they are.
I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but I recognize, of course, that this is absolutely a characterization you've levied at them. To talk extensively about damage done, say there's a political perspective not being heard, the people being left behind by the BLM movement, oh, they're violating social distancing, it was all for naught. This is exclusively negative coverage in every single one of these talking points I see on Fox News every day.
I didn't say they've been left behind by the BLM movement, more about the popular media narratives that are driven by actors who have a deep personal investment in the sanctity in their mind. If
a person's coverage, if a journalist's coverage of a given event seems to be exclusively appreciated and picked up by conservative media outlets or conservative-leaning individuals, I would consider the coverage of that event to be conservative, and thus their opinion on that event to be conservative.
So it's conservative not because there's inherently anything ideologically conservative about it, but because of those who engage with it.
Because because there are people who are too cowardly to take a deliberate stance on an issue and actually flesh out their points. So instead, they'll just gesture endlessly at their political position by complaining or criticizing incessantly one side of the aisle.
You're accusing me of being cowardly?
Well, I called you a weasel earlier, but I thought it would be good to mix up the term a little. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
You're calling me a coward.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Of course.
So
all you do is criticize BLM. That's all you do.
So doing a stream with you for nearly 2 hours, where I take all your questions and answer them to the best of my ability, still means that I'm.
Well, I mean, I've gone on a roller coaster before. I was shit scared the whole time, but I made it through. No, I'm not saying you're a coward in the sense that your bowels quiver at the thought of arguing with people. I'm saying that these positions are undeniably in the service of a conservative agenda, but you don't take ownership of that. You act as though you're just ambivalently, I just happen to exclusively cover this in ways that denigrate the BLM movement. You know? I mean,
I don't really agree.
It's like a Tim Pool kind of thing, you know? Do you think Tim Pool's a liberal?
I don't know. How does he? I honestly don't follow Tim Pool that closely. How does he identify himself?
He calls himself a liberal, but everything out of his mouth is like a far right talking point. So,
I mean, I'm genuinely telling you that I'm not familiar enough with his beliefs to say one way or another.
You're better off than me in that respect. Then don't go down.
But I kind of reject the premise that seeking out minorities whose lives were upended and radically harmed by, roughly speaking, this protest / riot movement is inherently conservative. Like, I would love it if leftists.
It's not just the coverage; it's the totality of your coverage. Would engage
more fulsomely with the actual effects of the protest movement that they champion with such unambiguous fervor. I mean, I think if you want to champion something, that's fine, but I think you should acknowledge and accept the full scope of what has transpired.
I agree, but in the context of your work, it paints a picture. Again, I return to my previous example, and if we can't agree on this, we'll never will. If I ask a person, how do you feel about gay people? And they go, well, I like this one gay guy, and I like brunch, and then they go and write like 8 articles on the damage done by the LGBT movement and how gay ideology is corrupting our children and blah, blah, blah. And then they run back. Like, this person, brunch is gay, guys. Sorry, my chat's confused. Brunch is a gay meal. This person,
really?
Even if they do not, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, that's new information for me.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Brunch had a sexual orientation.
Yeah. This person, even if they never committed to saying they dislike gay people or they're anti-LGBT, this person is giving off, in every practical sense, an identical consequential outcome to somebody who is anti-LGBT. And that's the position that I get from you on BLM. Your coverage is exclusively negative. when I ask you even what you like about it, you were incredibly tenuous, like one policy position, but you won't even praise the people who protested to make that position politically viable. But you'll go on Fox News to talk about the damage done by the protests.
Well, I'll go virtually anywhere within reason. I'm with you right now. So, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of tendentious to say, oh, you're on Fox News. I mean, what I said on Fox News on that Tucker appearance last week was exactly what I've said on left-wing media. So, yeah. I mean, the venue, I feel, should not be so prominent in terms of...
Well, the fact that Tucker Carlson was very keen on your take and would presumably have been keen on any of your other takes on BLM is the point, because Tucker Carlson is a conservative. It's not just that you went on there. It's that your points serve right-wing positions and right-wing talking points, and not left-wing positions and left-wing talking points.
Well, I mean...
There's nothing wrong with you being a conservative. Like, if you would just say, or like, I don't like BLM, that's fine. Like, my only issue here is the perceived ambiguity of your position, when I don't think it's very ambiguous at all.
Okay, I mean, I've tried to unambiguously lay out my position to you while still rejecting this idea that in order to be transparent, I have to say I like or dislike BLM. I've given you aspects of it that I like and aspects of it that maybe I find less savory, let's say, especially if I having walked around and seen the results of it in a lot of places, like for example,
no, it's I know, I'm sure there are pernicious anecdotes. I appreciate.
I mean,
your time.
I think calling them anecdotes is a little bit spurious. I mean, they're widespread enough to not be just mere anecdotes. I mean, you should go, if you're interested, go to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And
it's still anecdote. I mean, data requires protection against selection bias. So unless it has that, it's by definition anecdotes.
Oh, I mean, how do you do journalism without anecdotes? I mean, if you go and talk
can.
to
I'm just saying I'm presently uninterested in them. Okay. But I don't. But I'm
deny interested in talking to people, and if that gets dismissed as anecdotes, then so be it. But I still think talking to people who are generally underrepresented in media narratives is worthwhile.
I don't disagree with that. You can just paint any political point by finding someone. I could find like a black Confederate who would argue that racism doesn't exist, and easily, actually, going on YouTube, they seem to be pretty common.
But this is a criticism I've gotten often, that I cherry picked a lot of these examples. And
I'm not levying. I don't know.
Okay, but the point is, I mean, a black Confederate is a extreme minority in terms of opinion.
They're like 30% of the fucking YouTube conservatives I see these days. Jesus Christ.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah, they're all over the fucking place because they love the turncoats. Conservatives, like, hey, we got a black guy to say racism isn't real, you know? They love that shit.
Okay.
It's some rock hard.
Maybe so, but I'm trying to just relay to you as honestly as I possibly can that the opinions expressed by non-white residents of some of these places that were affected by riots are almost ubiquitous. I mean, you really do not have to cherry pick whatsoever. I mean, and that's why I sort of bristle when it gets cast as just anecdotes. I mean, it was almost universal in terms of the.
Well, yeah, of course, someone whose business has been burnt down by a protest is going to have a negative view on that protest. But I bet you, if I walked around the country for long enough, I could find more black Confederates than you could find people whose businesses were burnt down by BLM riots. Well, then we'll see what's anecdotal.
Not in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Oh, maybe not just in that city. Got to give me a little bit more time to walk around.
Okay, I mean Chicago, Milwaukee, Seattle.
I don't know. Maybe Chicago's got a lot of people in it. I don't know if I'd bet much on that from your end. That's a lot of wacky people in Chicago. I'm just saying you can come to a lot of positions.
I would bet you on that. I'll take you to the west side or south side of Chicago, and we can walk down the blocks and blocks and blocks of places that were boarded up.
All right. As long as we stay 6 feet apart, okay?
Yes, exactly.
All right. I appreciate you coming on.
All right. Did you want to make a quick Tulsi point? I thought you referenced that earlier.
Oh God. I just hate Tulsi Gabbard. I feel like the proximity to Tulsi Gabbard from any political commentator.
Because you said something like people who you find disreputable are somehow associated with her, or something to that effect.
Yeah, there's like a very sorry, Shoeonhead. There's a very specific like type of, I don't know if they're Democrats really. There's like, they tend to.
Sorry, I didn't pick up what you said. Sorry, what?
Shoeonhead, a friend of mine who likes Tulsi because she's hot. No, it's like Jimmy Dore or what's that woman's name? Kim Iverson. There are these political commentators who seem to be
both of whom I know. Both of whom I know.
I'm sorry. Who seem to be
no, it's okay. I don't.
Oh, then I am sorry. Who seem to be adjacent to Tulsi, and they're like Democrats, but they hate Democrats, and all they do is bitch about Democrats, and they sometimes criticize Republicans, and they tend to be very class reductionist. They like to complain that the BLM riots are idpol, or that Bernie went too woke, or some stupid shit like that, and they talk about how actually they need to work with the far right for some sort of shared populist agenda. My problem with the Rising, for the most part. And what they end up being functionally is blue Republicans. They bolster every conservative talking point about how bad the Democrats, how bad Biden is, and then they never substantiate it with criticisms of the right, and it just kind of seems like grift shit. I think Tulsi will probably enjoy her Fox News like panel slot for in a couple of years, and she'll have a lot of fun there, being the token I left the left because they got too woke or something like that.
Well, I mean, I think that's sort of a scurrilous portrayal of her. Especially in light of the fact that she endorsed Joe Biden.
I will cut my left arm off if she's not a Fox News panelist sometime before 2024.
Well, I mean, she appears on Fox News frequently, but I think she probably has other endeavors in mind. But yeah, I mean, I think there's in terms of the kind of constellation of figures associated in some rough sense with Tulsi, there is something to that, but there's also some irony there because, I mean, Tulsi did endorse Biden, just as she said she would, even though she was cast as some kind of right-wing Trojan horse or something, despite being a Democrat for her entire life, despite being a member of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives.
I will admit, I was surprised when she did that. I was expecting her to not endorse anyone. I was legitimately surprised when she did
the fact that you were surprised is indicative of how commonplace it was to totally distort her motives and her worldview, because she said all along in very plain English that she was going to support the eventual Democratic nominee.
I want to be clear,
she was subject to a fairly vicious campaign of mischaracterization and smears, I would say, which is why some people were surprised by something that she said all along she was going to do.
Yeah, it's possible I may have been a little too uncharitable with her. I'll recognize that. My issue is more with the people who seem to like her. Jimmy Dore is a fucking lunatic. Kim Iverson recently had a discussion with a contemporary of mine called Destiny, in which she laid out essentially every position that makes me want to kill myself. It was kind of like I actually had to break. I had to pause several times in the video and take deep breaths to sort of stifle the suicidality. I don't know. There's just something about her.
I'm glad you're still with us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too. I love life. Just something about being.
Me too, actually. I mean, people kind of always assume that I'm very angry or discontent with life or something. But I more or less enjoy myself.
No, we're having a good time together, just buddies on a campfire. I don't know. I think the fundamental
we
issue
both have impressive beards, which I know people enjoy.
is people who say like the Democrat and Republican parties are the same, or something to that effect. I feel like that's a misconception from which a lot of bad political agitation stems. But we are approaching 2 hours now, and at this point, we have to. By which I mean I have to go to the bathroom. I really do appreciate you.
Can I just ask? Do you feel this was a constructive discussion?
Significantly more so than I expected it to be. I'm not going to lie.
Okay, very good.
But I have a lot of screaming matches on my channel, so that encompasses a very broad range of potential discussions.
All right. Well, I found it constructive as well. So
I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for coming on, and best of luck with your internet.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.